Genesis chapter 2 verses 10 to 14. And a river went out of Eden to water the garden, and from thence it was parted and became into 4 heads. The name of the first is Pison, that is it which compasseth the whole land of Havilah, where there is gold, and the gold of that land is good. There is bdellium and the onyx stone. And the name of the second river is Gihon, the same is it that compasseth the whole land of Ethiopia. And the name of the third river is Hiddekel, and that is it which goeth toward the east of Assyria. And the fourth river is Euphrates. So where was the Garden of Eden located? That was a question that intrigued me when I was a child, because I wondered if it was possible to go to where the garden was, to see it, or at least to see the cherubims and a flaming sword which turned every way to keep the way of the tree of life, as chapter 3 verse 24 reads. Books that I read seemed to locate it in the Middle East, somewhere in the Tigris or Euphrates valleys. But that cannot be true, because the flood has so altered the topography of Earth that what we see now is completely different than the world that then was, as 2 Peter chapter 3 describes it. The sea is no longer gathered together onto one place, as we read in chapter 1 and verse 9. Eden was an elevated place, because we read that a river went out of Eden to water the garden, verse 10. And then downstream it was parted and became into 4 heads. And I think that this is very appropriate, because God's intention was that man would be elevated in creation. He was made to be head. How sad it is to see how low man has gone because of sin, acting at times even worse than the animals over which he was meant to have dominion. We can see that Eden was a well-watered place. We read in Psalm 1 verse 3 that the godly man shall be like a tree planted by the rivers of water, that bringeth forth his fruit in his season. Adam in paradise was to be just that, and God would have us to be like that too. In Jeremiah chapter 31 verse 12, the prophet describes the redeemed of Israel in this way: their soul shall be as a watered garden. I said yesterday that I enjoy other people's gardens, and I understand how important water is. A well-watered garden has freshness, it has colour, it has fragrance, and it has fruitfulness about it. And that is just what should characterise our lives and testimony as believers. Too often we are stale, grey, fusty and unfruitful. And really we could do with a lot of the watering of the Word of God to moisten our hearts. The 4 rivers mentioned here have been linked to modern day rivers, but again the world has been so altered since then that although some of the names seem familiar, it must be referring to earlier places of similar names. You say, how can that be? Well, in Canada there is a city called London. It's on the River Thames, and it's in the county of Middlesex, but it is not the English London that we know so well. The 4 rivers suggest to me a blessing flowing out of the garden to the 4 corners of the earth, a blessing that will be fully and finally realized in God's eternal kingdom, where the pure river of water of life proceeds out of the throne of God and of the Lamb, Revelation chapter 22, as it sends its refreshment to the 4 corners of that earth. Man has a garden. Now he has to keep it, and we'll think about that next.